There are many charities that do good works, but there aren't that many that use data to analyze and identify need and then get donors to send cash money straight to the people who will use it. The nonprofit GiveDirectly does, and joining us now from New York City to explain how it all works, Joe Huston, Regional Director in East Africa for GiveDirectly. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, Joe, if somebody said to me, Nam, here's $1,000, you can use it for whatever you want, I would think something was up. I would say, what do you want in return? So explain to me, how does GiveDirectly work?
Yeah, what we do is very simple. We deliver cash transfers directly to the poor, to some of the poorest people in the world. Those cash transfers have no strings attached. People can spend it however they want. And it's not a loan, it's a grant. They don't have to pay it back at any time. And you're right that that's very different from, I think, how we as the world have approached helping poor people in the past. But the evidence is pretty clear that giving cash is one of the best things you can do.
I'm surprised to hear that, because some people might say that when you give something to somebody, they become dependent. So how does this empower people?
Yeah. I think it's actually sort of one of the encouraging things about cash transfers, that there have been literally over hundreds of studies evaluating cash transfers basically all over the world. And when people receive the money, they spend it in a variety of ways because people are very different anywhere in the world, just like they're very different in Canada or the US. But you haven't seen that sort of type of dependency for what?
How do you decide who gets the money then? Who do you give it to?
Yeah, so the only criteria is very clear, that you have to be poor. And so if GiveDirectly is working in a given area, we'll apply different types of criteria to try to figure that out. To give people a sense, our average recipient lives on something like 65 cents a day. We typically work in more rural areas, and so our typical recipient will live in a house made of mud walls or mud floors. They're usually a subsistence farmer. But then after that, there's no other sorts of hoops to jump through or anything else. They just have to meet the objective criteria we lay out. And that'll vary from region to region. Sometimes it's as simple as what type of house are they living in, and sometimes it's a little bit more complicated.
And how do they get the cash?
We send the cash through mobile money. And so what that looks like is literally on our end, we're able to press a button on a laptop, and then thousands of people across Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda start receiving text messages that say that they've received $300 or so. They then take that money to any of the agents that are nearby that can help them withdraw it. It's a pretty sort of neat advancement over the last decade or so that allows you to send cash very directly to the person you want to send to, and pretty cheaply as well. And
can you give us some examples of what they use the money for?
Right. It's extremely varied, just because individual needs are very different. Some of the common themes we see are things like investments in livestock, maybe buying cows or goats or chickens, investments in their farms, whether that's buying land or paying someone to help them work on the land, or buying farm tools, investments in small businesses, like buying a motorcycle to become the sort of motorcycle taxi guy in town, or buying stock to start a small store. And also things that just help people sleep more easily, maybe getting a tin roof instead of a thatched one so you're not getting rained on. Of course, we've now enrolled something like 50,000 recipients, and so we've sort of seen everything. There was a guy, William, in Kenya who bought instruments and started a band. We also had a couple who bought solar panels and basically started a charging station in their village that's not otherwise electrified, but people were able to come to their house and charge their phones or anything else. Now, of course, these are just anecdotes, but the evidence sort of supports these, that when you give people cash, they spend on a variety of things because people have a variety of different wants. But the sort of results are pretty consistent, that you see people's earnings go up, assets go up, their overall well-being improve.
Of course, like you just said, you gave money to somebody and they started a band. I'm assuming that's not what the money you wanted. In a different situation, most people would use the money for that. But I'm wondering, like, in a community, if you do give money to one person and maybe not give it to the next person, do you find that, neighbors turn against each other, or it creates tension within the community if some people get money and then other people don't?
There's definitely a general thing that anytime you're giving something out that people want, if they don't receive, they might be a little bit upset. In the places where we work, we'll typically enroll 50% or more of the village, and we'll try to choose our criteria specifically to manage this risk. And so we'll choose things that are pretty transparent to people and seem fair. And so in the communities where we work, we'll try to make sure that the people who are included are the ones that the community would have sort of agreed are the poorest. One thing we've even tried out is asking the community themselves to nominate who is the neediest, and that worked pretty well as well.
Oh, wow. So you've never had a situation where everybody wants the money and says, I'm in need just as much as my neighbor is?
That's certainly the starting case, that even if you started handing out money in the US, pretty much everyone would sign up probably to receive $1,000. But if you sort of explain the situation, which is pretty clear, that we can either give money to wealthier people or give money to poorer people, people are usually pretty understanding.
And when you say poor, are you giving to people, you mentioned Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda. Are you specifically just operating in rural areas because you find that rural areas, there's more poverty instead of operating in the urban areas, or do you operate elsewhere?
We're currently focused basically totally on rural areas. I think sometime it would be great to experiment working in sort of more urban environments, but for now we're pretty focused on rural areas.
And specifically in Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda?
Right, exactly.
And how long do you give money for?
In our usual program, we'll give about $1,000 in 3 chunks over the course of about 5 months. The way we describe it to the recipients is that it's a one-time transfer, that this is their sort of one shot to receive a lot of money and invest it towards what they want. Something we're experimenting with starting next year is a longer-term program testing a universal basic income that would provide payments for some people up to 12 years.
Oh, wow. Where are you going to start that?
That'll be in Western Kenya as well.
And can you give us a little bit about the history of GiveDirectly? Where did this idea come from?
Right, so GiveDirectly was founded by 4 people in basically an economics grad school. And they were looking at 2 sort of converging trends in the world. The first was that the sort of evidence behind cash transfers was growing, that there was initial experiments mostly in Latin America and Brazil and Mexico, and then those results from those experiments were then replicated all over the world between Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And so there was a lot of evidence behind cash transfers that people spend it well, that even sort of after the money stops, people are better off. And of course, if you sort of measure what people spend on across study after study, you don't see things like increases in spending on alcohol or tobacco. You don't see people stop working. And so they're looking at that part of the reality where this is one of the sort of best interventions you can do, but there is no nonprofit exclusively devoted to doing it. The other trend that helped a lot was this sort of innovations in mobile payments, where for very, very little money you can deliver lots and lots of cash transfers directly to a recipient, directly to literally the phone in their hand. And so that's something that allows us to be a pretty efficient platform where 90% of every donated dollar goes straight to the poor.
And that's the technology that started in Kenya, M-Pesa?
Right, and so it's very well developed in Kenya, and then a little bit less well developed, but still very useful in Uganda and Rwanda and elsewhere in the developing world.
Now, if somebody's watching the show and wants to become involved with GiveDirectly, how can they get involved?
It's fairly easy. So you can go to our website and you can donate. Also, if you want to read more, we have one page that just goes through a lot of the evidence. I think there's something like 30 footnotes of the different papers evaluating cash transfers. Mm-hmm. If you want a sort of different side of GiveDirectly, you can go to a page we have called GD Live that just pipes data directly from the recipients, from our interactions with them, to our website. It's not filtered, it's not cherry-picked, it's just their words. And I think that site goes a sort of good way towards letting the poor speak for themselves. You get a sense of what their priorities are, what their challenges are, what their plans are for the money or in general for their lives, which is a pretty good way to start to get a sense of the logic for cash transfers, that you can enable a vast array of choices by people who have really good plans.
And why do you think people still think that giving cash directly is a bizarre concept?
I think a lot of the sort of conversations about how to help poor people are dominated by stereotypes or preconceptions about poor people. And I think a lot of that is not letting the poor speak for themselves. I think cash transfers does that somewhat directly, because poor people are in charge of how they want to spend the money and what they want to do to improve their lives. And I'm also hoping things like GD Live can sort of put microphones in front of poor people, and they can sort of direct what type of aid they most want to receive, how they want to sort of engage with people who want to help them.
I mean, everything sounds great what you're saying, but is there a downside to giving cash directly?
I think the sort of, there's always different types of operational problems. The sort of standard things you run into as part of running what is basically a large customer service organization. But I think the sort of main one is that it's up to the person. And I think it's a pretty encouraging thing about humans that when you give people cash, it works out pretty well. But there's no sort of other fallback. It's up to the person to improve their lives themselves once they receive the cash.
Joe Huston, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.